Welcome to chapter 14, where we're going to discuss different agricultural methods, the way we manage pests, which are, living creatures or living plants. So pests can really be classified as both, um, but you'll use different types of management strategies depending on what exactly you're controlling for. And so the outline for this chapter looks as follows. So we're going to first talk about the development of agriculture, fertilizer, and agriculture in general. Then we'll look at some chemical use, problems with using those chemicals and pesticides. We'll talk about why are these pesticides so widely used, and then we'll finish up looking at alternatives to conventional agriculture, which is going to overlap some with the conversations we had at the end of the last chapter when we were talking about soil conservation. So the development of ag, ag was really, or it really became this dominant feature when populations really decide or really figured out how to manipulate um, crops or manipulate plants growing in the natural environment to be utilized as food. So they figured out, they could take these crops and they could plant them in large quantities, and then they can produce food and get, yields that would feed their family, for the season. And the reliance on agriculture has allowed the human population to really increase in size because we've become so good at producing crops that give such a high yield that we get excess amounts of food. And so we would, sell off or trade our excess food while we stored enough food for, say, our families to have in a particular season. And there are several different types of agriculture that have existed and that still exist today. One of the common types of agriculture is known as shifting ag. This is basically where somebody will go in, they'll cut down a small forested area, they'll burn the trees and the vegetation to incite a pulse of nutrients that was bound up in the biomass of the forest and the vegetation on the ground floor, and then they'll farm that area for a couple of years. That area will be useful for growing for about 2 to 3 years, so it will eventually become nutrient poor after that time, and they'll have to allow a forest to recolonize that area, and then they'll cut it down and burn it again. But that usually takes a long time in order for that recovery cycle to happen. And so it's going to be many years before they're going to be able to reuse that field for agriculture and for crops. And so during that time, they'll move to a different place that they will cut down and use for a couple of years. And so they're constantly shifting the locations of their fields and allowing that recovery time to happen. This type of ag is really useful in the thin, nutrient poor tropical soils because remember, all of the nutrients is bound up in that biomass. And however, it's not suitable for large, densely populated areas because again, you're only producing so much from this type of farming. And the shifting agricultural method or agriculture method employs what's known as a polyculture, where you're growing a mixture of crops and plants. The large intensive ag, mechanized ag that, say, much of the US does is known as a monoculture. It only grows one crop on the field at a time. And this type of shifting ag is pretty labor intensive and is actually practiced in a lot of areas around the world. And the areas in which it's practiced is where sites don't allow for the machines to come in. The crop doesn't allow for mechanization, so you can't really use machines on that specific crop type, or the economic condition doesn't allow for the purchase of the mechanized equipment. So basically the population, the culture, the people doing the shifting ag method just can't afford the machinery, or they can't afford to, pay for the repairs and the maintenance of the machinery that it takes to run those big mechanized operations. Now, this shifting ag is a real labor intensive ag. And the reason we see labor intensive ag is because it's economic. It costs less for people to go out and produce that manual labor than it does for these cultures and these populations to uh, buy and maintain those heavy machineries, those large tractors and large machinery, and that it takes to run those big ag operations. And a lot of these densely populated countries will have numerous small farms that are managed with human labor, larger families that are, or you have multiple families kind of working together in a community that's maintaining these ag fields. Now, when you look at kind of the opposite side of the coin and you compare that type of agriculture with this mono agriculture like we see in industrialized and developed countries, there's a very big difference in terms of how that ag is done. Fossil fuels are replacing muscle power, and the mechanized monoculture requires large amounts of energy to run those machines, and also the energy that's tied up in the production of fertilizers is substantial. And so not only does that require a large amount of energy, but it also requires flat land, because you have to be able to drive that machinery over those fields multiple times in order to plant and harvest those crops. And the monocultures actually have more efficient planting, cultivating, and harvesting methods because they're focusing on one type of crop at, in every field. So they don't have to say switch machines, or switch between different fertilizing methods or any of that in a single field. They can take one machine, they can run it over the field to plant, one machine to harvest, and they're done, right? It's pretty efficient in terms of the time that it takes for the farmers to put in, say, labor hours in order to get a crop. And the farmers are actually relying on hybrid crops to provide their monocultures. And these crops have been bred to be high yield crops, to grow during drought-like conditions, to not take as much water, so on and so forth. And so they're really relying on these genetically modified crops in order for to be successful in a lot of these areas. And so if we look at mechanized agriculture and how it's reduced the number of labor hours required to produce a set amount of crop, if we look at 1913, it took about 135 hours of labor to produce 2,500 kilograms of corn. You compare that to 1980, only 15 hours to produce 2,500 kilograms of corn. That's almost 10 times the reduction in labor hours. That's substantial. But like we mentioned, it takes a lot of fossil fuel to not only run those machines, but it also takes a lot of fossil fuel to produce that fertilizer. So we're talking about 5 metric tons of fossil fuel to produce 1 metric ton of fertilizer. That fertilizer production is super energy intensive. And so a lot of the developed world is dependent on oil to produce energy to manufacture the pesticides and the fertilizer, as well as to run the machines. So therefore, the price of oil affects how much money the farmers have to put into their crops, which in turn affects the price of food itself and the ability of people to feed themselves. And so now there are a couple of issues with monoculture, and we mentioned some of these whenever we were talking about the soil chapter. Basically, with mechanized mono ag, you have large tracts of bare land. And as you recall, that increases soil erosion. Um, you also have that monoculture that is planting genetically identical seeds. You're only planting one crop, you're reducing genetic diversity in the crops. And so there's this overall loss of genetic diversity in these plants. What's bad about this loss of genetic diversity is if there is a disease, and say one of your individuals in your field is susceptible to that disease, then your entire field is susceptible to that disease. And if you're using the same seeds in all of your fields, then that whole crop that you have is susceptible to a specific disease. And there's no variation in those individuals to allow for resistance to be there. So if one is susceptible, then all of your crop is susceptible. So that loss of genetic diversity is really big if something like that happens. And the little genetic differentiation also means you have to use increased pesticides because of that factor. And there's also no crop rotation. So you're continually depleting soil nutrients and you're using that field over and over every single year. And so you're increasing the amount of fertilizer that you have to use. So you're not putting nutrients back into the soil and allowing that organic matter to kind of recycle those nutrients that plants need. You're continually growing plants, taking those plants off the landscape, and no organic matter is going back into the soil. So eventually your soil nutrients will run out. And then that fossil fuel energy is replacing human energy. And, you have all of the downsides of using fossil fuel that we've talked about in earlier chapters. Now, with fertilizer and agriculture, 25% of the world's crop is attributed to chemical fertilizer use. So 25% is heavily reliant on that fertilizer for use. And like we mentioned, those fertilizers are replacing the soil nutrients that's not being recycled back into those soils. And so the price and availability of those fertilizers is tied to those energy prices because the energy is needed to develop and produce those fertilizers. And in terms of nutrients, there are three primary soil nutrients that are necessary for plants. And this is your macronutrients. So this is your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and your potassium. If you've ever looked at a bag of fertilizer, you would see potentially some three numbers like this. So it's like 10, 10, 10. This is basically saying the content of each of these fertilizers. So it's like 10 nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, or potassium. Or you could have like different numbers where it'd be like 10, 20, 10, or 20, 20, 20, or whatever. And so that's telling you the amount of macronutrients that that fertilizer has in that bag. And depending on what you're growing, depends on the type of fertilizer you would buy. Now, plants also need micronutrients, so they need these types of nutrients in much smaller amounts and not as much as macronutrients. And usually your macronutrients are going to be your limiting factors. So remember, we discussed limiting factors, and whichever one is the lowest in the soil is going to be the limiting factor, and that's the one that you'll want to raise using fertilizer. So some of the micronutrients are things like boron, zinc, and manganese. And again, those are needed in much, much smaller amounts compared to the macronutrients. But the issue with these fertilizer use is that the chemical fertilizer is not replacing that soil organic matter. And remember that organic matter is really important for soil structure. It's part of those horizons, and the soil structure and function really depends on the presence of that organic matter. And if you're using that organic matter to grow your crops over several years, if you're not putting organic matter back in, you're going to substantially change the structure of that soil. And so the total dependency on chemical fertilizers reduces the amount of organic matter. And so you're changing the properties of that soil, which could eventually end up being really bad for the soil that you're farming on. And so if we look at increasing fertilizer use in different countries across the world from the 50s, the 80s, and the 2020, you'll see that it's a steady increase regardless of which country you're looking at. Some countries, the slope is substantially higher, but if you notice the world total, big jump in terms of million nutrient tons. Okay, so this is million nutrient tons. That is a lot of fertilizer being used. And you see your lesser developed countries are using less fertilizer because they're more of this sustenance farming where they're doing that manual labor, and they're doing, like shifting agriculture, for example. Whereas your developed countries and your developing countries are really using a lot of fertilizer. Now, not only do we use fertilizers to help provide nutrients that our crops need to grow, but we also use pesticides to help control unwanted pests that could kill our crop populations. And so a pesticide is a chemical that would kill any type of pests that we don't want in our crops. So fungi, plants, animals, um, and pesticides can be divided into different categories based on the organisms that they're targeting the control of. So for example, if it's controlling plants, it's an herbicide. If it's controlling mice or rats, it's a rodenticide. Fungus is fungicides, insects are insecticides, and then if they just kill or target a large variety of organisms, they're known as biocides. Okay, and whatever pest the pesticide is targeting is generally referred to as the target organism. And what's a big downside of pesticides is that they also kill non-target organisms as a side effect. Um, and so we can also have pesticides that will stay in the environment for a long period of time. These are known as persistent pesticides. Or you can have non-persistent pesticides that break down relatively quickly. Um, so for example, we have common organophosphates, which are widely used in gardens. You have like carbaryl, propoxur, aldicarb. These are example of carbamates, and you will see these if you've grown gardens before as 7. So there's like a spray and there's also a dust. It was one of the ones that I remember my dad using in our garden when I was younger. 7 dust. We would put it in a potato sack and go shake it over your plants, and it would put this white dust on your plants, and that would get rid of the aphids and the caterpillars and things that were chewing our crops. And so those are examples of some of the common pesticides that we use. Herbicides, they control unwanted plants, and are used really heavily in genetically modified crops. In the US, a majority of the pesticides used are herbicides. And the big reason you want to get rid of these weeds is because they're competing with your crop for soil nutrients and water. And that means that that's less resources that your crops are going to be able to get, so they're not going to be as productive. Um, the traditional weed control methods are expensive in terms of time and energy. So basically going out manually getting rid of those weeds, controlling those weeds with human labor, is very time consuming, and they can use these pesticides to get rid of those plants a lot faster. But again, downside is they don't target just one species. It's targeting non-target species as well, which could be a big problem. Now, looking at insecticides, this is what you control insect populations with. This, 3,000 years ago, Homer, he even noted, and sulfur could be used to control insects. So pesticides were being used 3,000 years ago. And we've known for a very long time that plants will produce natural insect repellents. So, for example, nicotine in tobacco is an insect repellent. Chrysanthemums produce an insect repellent. Um, Tropical legumes will create an insect repellent as well. And so there are these plants that have these natural chemicals that they produce to help reduce herbivory impacts. Um, and so figuring out how we could use chemicals to control and protect our crops was kind of a big deal. And not only can we use chemicals to protect our crops, but we also can use these chemicals to control the presence of disease. So, for example, mosquitoes carry a lot of diseases that are harmful to humans, and we figured out, hey, we can use these insecticides to keep down insect populations, which helps to lower the incidence of these diseases. In 1867, we have the formation of the production of the first synthetic inorganic insecticide. In 1942, DDT, which you probably heard of, at least mentioned somewhere, I would assume, became the first synthetic organic insecticide produced. And there are a bunch of new categories that were produced, but DDT, the reason I say you might have heard of DDT is because it's actually banned now, and a lot of places around the world, and is effectively not used anymore. DDT is this long-lasting, persistent pesticide that we'll get into much more detail here in a little bit. But with these different pesticides, chlorinated hydrocarbons are an example of long-lasting, persistent pesticides. So they stay in the environment for long periods of time. After you apply them to your target location, they accumulate in the soils, and then animals that get these pesticides accumulate the pesticides. And they also target or affect non-target organisms, and like DDT, not used in many parts of the world anymore, but developing countries still may use them to protect their crops. Um, because of their persistence, they do remain present in the food chain, and then they can undergo what's known as bioaccumulation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So some other classes are organophosphates and carbamates. So these are short-lived pesticides. They don't last long in the environment. And what these do is they affect the nervous system, and they prevent the nervous system from conducting impulses to allow your body to function. And so these pesticides can also affect not only the nerve cells of animals, insects, and other organisms, but also humans and other vertebrates. And so they're really not specific in what they affect, and you have to be careful where you apply these. And then the people who actually apply these type of pesticides, they have to be trained in how to handle them safely so they don't get hurt or harmed in the application process of those pesticides. Now, herbicides, target plants. So there are regulators that we've developed, synthetic regulators that mimic natural regulators produced by plants, so like auxins. And basically what herbicides will do is they'll, affect the photosynthetic pathway or the enzymes that allow physiological processes or cellular processes to run. And so if you're disrupting those pathways, you're basically stopping the organism from functioning as it's supposed to, which will lead to the death of that organism. And just like with the other pesticides, herbicides, some of them, depending on the type, are not toxic, or I'm sorry, they are toxic to all plants, so they're non-selective. And some are selective. Again, just depends on which one you're using. So atrazine is often used to control, say, grassy weeds, broadleaf weeds, and then you have glyphosate, which is basically Roundup, and it's a non-selective herbicide that you can use to control a lot of different annual and perennial plants. Now, some of the last pesticides that exist are fungicides and rodenticides. So fungicides protect crops from spoilage to prevent the spread of fungus and prevent the seeds from rotting in the ground before they can germinate. And so an example is methylmercury, which is extremely toxic to humans, that is potentially used as a fungicide in a lot of different places. For rodents, there are governments that actually pay for people to get rid of rats and mice because they destroy agricultural crops. Rodents are also known to carry disease, and so rodenticides can, get rid of the rodents that can cause those diseases. But the rodenticides have to be used carefully because they can kill non-target organisms, including humans. When you buy, say, rat poison or something like that and put in your home, or you'll read on the back, there's do not swallow, do not ingest. If it gets in your eyes or on your skin, you have to go to call poison control because they can harm humans just as much as they can harm the rodents that you're trying to get rid of. So those are all of the different categories of pesticides that you can use in an ag setting, right? When you're growing crops. Now, problems with pesticides are that they're not perfect. They all have cons and issues that are associated with their use. A perfect pesticide, right? A quote unquote perfect pesticide would be inexpensive, doesn't take a lot of energy to make. It would only affect the organism that you want it to affect. It would not have any, it wouldn't affect other non-target organisms. It would have a short half-life, and it wouldn't last or persist in the environment, and it would break down into harmless materials that don't harm the environment if they remain in the environment. Newer pesticides are being constructed to fall in these categories, but we're still not there. There's still no pesticide that has all of these characteristics. So, every pesticide has an issue that we have to take into account before we use it, especially these persistent pesticides, because they can become attached to soil particles, and then the wind and the water can move those soil particles around, distribute them around the world. Persistent pesticides have been discovered in polar ice. They're in detectable amounts in animals and also humans, depending on where you're at, if you live near farms or locations that use these persistent pesticides on a regular basis. Now, I said we would come back to DDT and talk about bioaccumulation. So bioaccumulation is where every step you take up in the food web, you get higher and higher amounts of the chemical that you're tracking within the organism's body. And so with these persistent pesticides, those pesticides are basically fat soluble. And so they accumulate in the fat tissues of the organisms. And so if you have a plant that has a pesticide on it and that snail eats that plant, the snail will build up some of that pesticide in its tissues. Then let's say you have a fish or a bird that eats those snails, and they eat many of those snails. Every snail they eat adds to the amount of chemical that is within the tissues. So the fish that eats the snail is going to have more of that pesticide in its tissues than the snail Because a snail is this accumulation of that pesticide. And so that fish is going to have more than the snail. And if there's a bird that eats that fish, the bird will accumulate the pesticide in the fish's tissues. And then if something eats the bird, so on and so forth. So the chemical accumulates higher and higher up the trophic level. And that process is biomagnification. So acquiring an increasing level as you go up the trophic level. So things like DDT, mercury, PCBs, all accumulate in ecosystems and undergo biomagnification. And so this was found out in the early 1970s. And so DDT was banned because of this known bioaccumulation factor. And so this is an example of the amount of DDT in tissues based off of the food web. And so these lower levels have lower amounts of DDT, but because these organisms are eating many other things that have that DDT and it's basically accumulating, once you get up the trophic level, you have high amounts of DDT in these upper trophic levels. We're talking about 18, 20 times the amount of the lower trophic levels. So bioaccumulation is a really big issue in terms of what pesticides we use and how it can affect organisms in adjacent ecosystems. Pesticide resistance is also a problem with the wide use of pesticides. So for example, insecticides only kill susceptible individuals. Because there's variation in insects populations, some individuals could be, and most likely are, resistant to a pesticide. So those surviving individuals will have that resistance that allowed them to survive the application of that pesticide. Now, when they reproduce, they have a chance to pass on that resistance gene to their offspring, and then their offspring can pass on that resistance to their offspring, and so the population over time becomes more and more resistant to that pesticide. And so multiple pesticide applications later, you're not really getting rid of that pest population because now they're resistant. And so most pesticides also are not species specific, and they kill not only the pests but beneficial species as well. Many pesticides will kill predator and parasitic insects that normally control pest insects. So for example, ladybugs will eat aphids. Aphids is one of the problem insects that we get on our crops. When you apply an insecticide, most of the time you're killing ladybugs as well as the aphids, when you potentially could be using the ladybugs as a way to control your aphids problem. And insecticides also change the population structure of the species present, so that species that were previously not a problem because, say, an insect predator existed may become a problem because you just removed that insect predator. And so there are a lot of ways that applying an insecticide could affect your crops in unintentional ways. Okay, now looking at human health concerns. So when we apply these chemicals, these pesticides to our crops, we're directly putting it on our crops, and we're also allowing it to be present in ecosystems, be blown around, etc. Some of these pesticides persist, some of them don't persist. And so what we end up with are these potential, or is this potential for short-term and long-term health effects to the people that apply these pesticides, and then to the people that consume the products that these pesticide residuals were on. Acute poisoning for the people that apply these pesticides can occur, especially if the farmers or the people applying it don't wear the appropriate gear. And the World Health Organization estimates that between 1 million and 5 million acute pesticide poisonings occur annually, resulting in 20,000 deaths. So, if the appropriate measures were taken, those are deaths that most likely could have been prevented. Now, I don't want to say all of them because they are all unique situations. Some accident could have occurred, or something bad could have happened, right? But most of the time, knowledge is a way to prevent these type of deaths from happening. Um, the most critical health problem, though, is inadvertent exposure to small quantities over and over again for many years. And so, for example, farmers who are exposed little by little over many years have higher levels of certain cancers than the general public because these pesticides are inducing these cancers to happen. So those chronic minute exposures, so in food or through contaminated environments, are also a big concern. And there are a lot of, and generally we're not really sure how this is affecting us. Right? We don't have enough information on that, not enough research. So with all of these concerns, why are pesticides so widely used then? Well, if we didn't use pesticides, then 35% of the crops worldwide would most likely be destroyed. Pesticides increase yields and profits for the farmers, so more money for the farmers because they're growing more food for the population. And insecticides also curtail many diseases. So think about the mosquito issue. And so that's why, we still use pesticides, even though these health and environmental concerns, and we're trying to find kind of the best solution to these two, clashing um, issues. Now, looking at kind of ways we could move away from conventional ag and also reduce not only the energy use, the um, soil degradation issues, environmental issues, and pesticide use, would be some alternatives to conventional ag. So whenever you have mechanization, many farmers went from that mixed agriculture to monoculture. And this, like I mentioned earlier, allows for those pest problems to develop. Because you're growing one crop, that pest can basically devour that crop. Usually, when you have a mixed agriculture, some plants will house predators of pests on other plants, and you can use the biological food web to serve as your pest controlling mechanism. In order to get around that, chemical pesticides basically solve the problem. But as we know, there are significant issues that come with the use of those chemical pesticides. So before synthetic fertilizers and other chemicals, animal manure and crop rotation help to provide soil nutrients. You would use a mixture of crops to prevent those pest problems, and then manual labor to get rid of insects and weeds. Um, when we look at some ways to do alternative ag, um, you could do what's known as just alternative agriculture, so all non-traditional agricultural methods. You could do sustainable ag, which is where you want to generate safe food supplies in an economically and ecologically healthy manner, where you're generating funds, you're generating food for the population, but you're also doing it while maintaining ecosystem health. And then the other one is organic agriculture. And so organic agriculture uses no artificial fertilizers, no chemicals, no antibiotics, no pesticides, and no GMOs. And if they use any of these in any amount, then they're not able to be certified as organic. And now we know it takes more time and more effort in order to grow crops this way. So organic crops tend to be slightly more expensive than your mechanized or conventional agricultural crops. Um, so what we're trying to do is to generate this sustainable approach to agriculture, right? Our overall goal is to keep pests at a minimum without the need of using these chemicals. We want to keep soil profiles healthy, water resources from being polluted. We want to do it at a cost efficient way while keeping ecosystems healthy and maintaining biological diversity. And we want, um, insect and disease resistant plants. We want beneficial insects to help keep the pests away without using or relying on any of these methods or chemicals that could harm us and the environment. But getting to a way or getting to a mechanism that allows us to actually do this is the extremely difficult part. Some techniques that are used for protecting soil and water resources are basically just producing changes in production methods to reduce soil compaction and loss of organic matter. So basically the number of times the equipment will go over the land, putting crop residues onto the soil so that organic matter can build back up, reduce fertilizer runoff into aquatic ecosystems, and then also think about when you use pesticides and what types of pesticides you use, and during what seasons you use them, because that can reduce the effect on the environment if you're knowledgeable about the ecosystem surrounding your farms. Um, Precision ag is a new technique that is trying to address many of the concerns we've mentioned. So, in the combination with computer technology, GIS, so geographic information systems, soil topography, you can look at um, automatically varying the amount of chemicals applied to a crop at different places in a field, and basically specifically targeting certain areas to only have those chemicals applied. And then also using crop rotation to enhance soil fertility, to reduce erosion, and then to control any pests that you would have during this type of process. There's also integrated pest management where you're using a variety of methods other than just pesticides to control pests. So for this, you have to be very knowledgeable about the crops that you're growing, and you have to be knowledgeable about the food web interaction, so the biological interactions between pests and predators. Know what plants favor the predators of the pests and what plants house specific pests, and then you can kind of interweave crops and plants together to generate this biological food web that's going to kind of control itself. You want to understand kind of the environmental conditions that favor pests, and then techniques to encourage the beneficial pests that are going to come in and help get rid of those pests. Um, you can do several methods to employ integrated pest management. So one, you can disrupt the reproduction timing of the pests by doing male sterilization or implementing female pheromones, or you could just bring in natural predators. So for example, aphids can be controlled with ladybugs or other bacterial strains that will directly target that pest species. So here you have the introduction of ladybugs at a specific time, and then you have the amount of pest density after those ladybugs. Notice the use of DDT allows for those pests to resurge. You killed the ladybugs as well, but once that system was allowed to become normal with ladybugs present, it basically stays at this kind of general average pest equilibrium. Um, just to mention genetically modified crops. So these are just resistant crops that are developed through genetic engineering or different methods of biotechnology, where you take specific pieces of DNA from other crops. So let's say you have a type of corn, a species of corn that is very drought resistant, and you take the gene that is drought resistant and you insert it into a related corn species that is not drought resistant. So now all of a sudden you've genetically modified an organism to be more drought resistant, so you can plant it in an area where it wouldn't have been able to be planted before. You can also do this with herbicide resistance. You can do it with pest resistance. So if there's naturally occurring genes, you can take those and put them in other groups of crop plants or species in order to get that resistance or that genetic modification in the plant itself. In terms of economic and social aspects of sustainable agricultural, if we modify farming practices, we can, really try to get at some of the issues that we've mentioned. So, for example, crop rotation helps prevent the buildup of specific pests, because if you raise the same crop year after year, those pests don't have to go anywhere. They're able to persist in that environment year after year and build up their population. Crop rotation helps prevent that and kind of helps knock that population down. Selective use of pesticides is another big deal. So identifying when to apply pesticides can have a big impact. So not waiting until the pest has a full-blown large population, but trying to get it before that happens, where you can use the lowest possible dose and not have to just spray a ton because the population's out of control. And so here's the summary for this chapter. So summary page 1. Here's the second one, and the third one. And as always, use these summary pages as key starting points for you to study. Remember, this isn't all of the information you need to know, but a good starting point for your study guide. Remember, you can contact me if you have any questions, if you have any concerns. You can email me, you can contact me through the discussion board. And with that, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next chapter.